Why did no one ask her the one question that mattered most? Lieutenant Sarah Martinez felt the rotor blades slicing through Afghan air above her head, the dust storm they created forcing her eyes into a permanent squint. 28 years old, 3 tours behind her, boots hitting foreign soil for what felt like the 100th time, yet somehow like the first. The helicopter was already lifting away, eager to escape before becoming a target, and she was alone on the landing zone with her duffel bag and the weight of what she knew was coming. Fob Kilo stretched before her like a small fortress built on borrowed time. Concrete barriers formed protective rings around temporary buildings that pretended to be permanent. Razor wire caught the morning light. Watchtowers stood like silent sentries against mountains that looked like sleeping giants in the distance, their peaks wrapped in haze that could hide anything, or nothing. She grabbed her gear and moved toward the command center, her steps deliberate, her mind already working through the intelligence reports she'd read on the flight in. Something wasn't adding up. Missions launched with solid intel were coming back empty. Patrols finding nothing where everything should have been. It was like chasing ghosts who knew exactly when to disappear. The base hummed with the familiar chaos of a joint operation. Army, Marines, Air Force technicians hunched over communication equipment, support staff keeping the machine running. She'd seen it all before, this mix of uniforms and specialties, this controlled disorder that somehow worked. But there was something else here too, something she couldn't quite name yet, a tension underneath the routine. Colonel James Harrison greeted her in the command center with a handshake and a tired smile that spoke of too many years in too many war zones. Gray hair, weathered face, eyes that had seen things he'd never talk about over dinner. "Welcome to Kilo, Lieutenant Martinez," he said, and his voice carried the weight of command and something that might have been warning. "I've read your file. Impressive work in Kandahar and Helmand. We need that kind of expertise here." She settled into the chair across from his desk, studying the satellite images he spread before her like cards in a deadly game. Valleys marked with red, supply routes traced in blue, question marks where certainty should have been. "We've been tracking increased Taliban activity in these areas," Harrison explained, pointing to locations that formed a pattern she could already see forming in her mind. Supply routes, weapons caches, possible training camps, but something's not adding up. Our patrols keep coming up empty. The intelligence we're getting from local sources doesn't match what we're seeing on the ground. Sarah's trained eye moved across the images, picking up details others might miss, shadows that didn't belong, terrain features that could hide movement. "What kind of time frame are we looking at for these reports?" she asked. "Past 6 weeks, right around the time my previous intelligence officer rotated out." Harrison leaned back, and there it was, the thing she'd been waiting for. "Look, I'll be straight with you. Some of the men here are still getting used to the idea of women in combat roles. Most of them are professional about it, but you might encounter some resistance." She'd heard this speech before, in different offices, different countries, different wars. The words changed, but the message stayed the same: prove yourself again. "I understand, sir," she said, her voice steady as stone. "I'm here to do a job, and I intend to do it well." What she didn't say was that she'd been proving herself her entire life, that she'd learned long ago that actions spoke when words only echoed. That resistance wasn't something she feared, it was something she expected. Her quarters were basic: a cot, a metal locker, a desk that had seen better days. She unpacked with the efficiency of someone who'd done this too many times to waste movement, changed into her duty uniform, checked her watch. The afternoon briefing was in 3 hours, which gave her time to do what she did best: analyze, absorb, understand. The files painted a picture that troubled her. Mission after mission launched on what should have been solid intelligence. Reconnaissance patrols finding empty compounds, weapon caches that had been moved just hours before. It was almost like someone was reading their playbook. She sat at her desk, surrounded by maps and reports, and let her mind work the way it always did, finding patterns, connecting dots, seeing what others couldn't see because they were too close to the problem. Growing up in Texas in a military family, she'd learned early that there were two types of people in war: those who reacted, and those who anticipated. Her father had been Gulf War infantry. Her brother was a Marine who still sent her emails that were mostly jokes and occasionally wisdom. But Sarah had always been drawn to the puzzle, not the fight. The why before the how. Intelligence work suited her the way a glove fits a hand. The briefing room was packed. 20 military personnel around a large table, more standing along the walls. The air felt charged, focused, dangerous in the way that rooms full of warriors always feel dangerous, contained energy waiting for direction. Colonel Harrison introduced her, highlighting her previous assignments, and she caught the looks. Some neutral, some curious, some openly skeptical, and then there was one in particular. A Navy SEAL chief, she'd learned his name was Briggs, sitting with his arms crossed and an expression that said he'd already made up his mind about her. She filed it away, not with anger, just awareness. "Thank you for the introduction, Colonel," Sarah began, her voice clear, carrying to every corner of the room. "I'm here to help improve our intelligence gathering and analysis capabilities. I've reviewed the recent mission reports, and I believe there are opportunities to enhance our effectiveness." She moved to the map on the wall, pointing to specific areas, and felt the room's attention shift from polite to engaged. Professional soldiers recognized competent analysis when they heard it, regardless of who was delivering it. She outlined her observations, the patterns she'd identified, the recommendations that would change how they operated, and for a moment she thought maybe this would be different. Maybe this time competence would be enough from the start, but as the room began to empty after the briefing, she heard them. Two soldiers near the back, speaking in voices they thought were low enough. "Another desk jockey trying to tell us how to do our jobs. What's she going to know about real field work?" "Give her time," the other replied, and Sarah heard the doubt underneath the diplomacy. Maybe she'll prove herself right, because sitting in an air-conditioned office analyzing satellite photos is the same as being out there dodging bullets. She kept packing her materials, her expression neutral, her movement steady. This was the part they never showed in the recruitment videos, the part where you had to prove yourself worthy of trust that should have been automatic. The part where your credentials meant less than your gender, and your experience counted for nothing until you'd earned the right for it to count for something. But here's what they didn't understand yet. She wasn't here to prove anything to them. She was here to do a job, and whether they believed in her or not, she would do it better than anyone they'd seen before. Why do some people need to see failure before they'll allow success? Sarah spent her first 2 weeks at Fob Kilo doing what she'd always done, working while others watched, analyzing while others doubted, building the foundation while others waited for cracks to appear. She reviewed every piece of intelligence that came through the operations center, studied patterns in enemy movement, cross-referenced patrol reports with satellite imagery, interviewed soldiers returning from missions, asking questions that made them think, that made them remember details they hadn't thought mattered. And slowly, quietly, she began to see what others had missed. The previous intelligence officer hadn't been incompetent. He'd been working with the wrong assumptions, treating the enemy like they were static, predictable, following old playbooks. But the Taliban had adapted. They'd learned the rhythms of American patrols, the timing of aerial surveillance, the patterns that made them vulnerable. Sarah saw it in the data, a ghost pattern, a negative space where activity should have been but wasn't. Chief Briggs and his SEAL team were planning another reconnaissance mission. She'd seen it on the ops board, studied the target location they'd selected based on previous intelligence. And she knew, not guessed, not suspected, but knew they were going to come back empty again, because the enemy had already moved. The question was whether to say something, whether to risk the confrontation that would come from challenging the plan, whether to expose herself to the skepticism she knew was waiting. She found Briggs in the operations center, studying the same maps she'd been analyzing. He looked up when she approached, and his expression was exactly what she expected, polite tolerance masking impatience. "Chief Briggs," she said, keeping her voice professional, neutral, "I've been reviewing the intelligence for your upcoming mission. I have some concerns about the target location." He straightened, crossing his arms. That defensive posture men adopt when they've already decided you're wrong. The intelligence package was put together by the previous analyst. It's solid. It was solid 6 weeks ago, Sarah said, pulling out her own analysis, spreading it on the table between them. But look at the pattern. Every target hit in this valley has been abandoned 24 to 48 hours before our teams arrived. They know our operational tempo. They're moving ahead of us. Briggs glanced at her analysis, but she could see he wasn't really looking. Not yet. So what are you suggesting, Lieutenant? That we just stop running missions because the enemy might have figured out our schedule? There was an edge to his voice now, sharper than necessary. I'm suggesting we change our approach. Instead of hitting the targets we think they're using, we identify where they'll move next. Cut them off instead of chasing them. With all due respect, and she heard the words that always came before disrespect, you've been here 2 weeks. My team has been running operations in this valley for 6 months. I think we know the terrain better than someone reading satellite photos in an air-conditioned room. There it was, the line in the sand, the challenge wrapped in professional language but clear as a slap. Sarah could have backed down. Should have, maybe, according to the unwritten rules about rank and deference and not making waves. But she'd learned long ago that sometimes the only way through resistance was straight ahead. You're absolutely right, Chief. You know the terrain better than I ever will. You know how to move through it, how to fight in it, how to survive in it. She paused, holding his gaze. But that's not my job. My job is to see the patterns you can't see because you're too close to them. My job is to keep you and your team from walking into empty compounds while the enemy watches from the next valley over. For a long moment he just stared at her, and then something shifted in his expression. Not agreement, not respect, but a crack in the certainty. A moment of doubt. "Show me your alternative target," he said finally, and that was all she needed. She walked him through her analysis, not defending, not arguing, just presenting, showing him the pattern of enemy movement, the logistics of how they relocated, the predictable elements in their seemingly unpredictable behavior. Where the previous analyst had seen random activity, Sarah had identified a system. Where others saw chaos, she found rhythm. Briggs asked questions, sharp ones, challenging her assumptions, testing her logic. And she answered each one with data, with analysis, with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing you're right even when everyone else needs convincing. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time, studying the maps, running scenarios in his head. Whatever calculation he was making, she couldn't read it on his face. "I'll take this to Colonel Harrison," he said finally. "See if he wants to modify the mission parameters." It wasn't agreement, but it wasn't dismissal either. It was something in between, professional consideration grudgingly given. As he turned to leave, Sarah felt the weight of what she'd just done. Not proved herself. Not yet. But created an opening. Forced him to see her not as a woman playing at intelligence work, but as an analyst who might actually know something he didn't. The days that followed were tense. The mission was postponed while her analysis was verified through additional surveillance. She knew what that meant. If she was wrong, if her alternative target came up as empty as all the others, her credibility here was finished. Not just questioned. Finished. She'd be the analyst who thought she knew better than the operators, who wasted time and resources on theories that didn't pan out. But she wasn't wrong. The additional surveillance confirmed everything she'd predicted. Enemy activity at exactly the locations she'd identified. Movement patterns that matched her analysis. Logistics that proved her theory about how they were staying ahead of patrols. Colonel Harrison called her into his office, and this time when he looked at her, something had changed. "Your analysis was correct," he said simply. "We're greenlighting a modified operation based on your recommendations." It should have felt like vindication, like victory, but all Sarah felt was the responsibility of what came next, because now her analysis wasn't theoretical. Now operators would move based on her words, her patterns, her predictions. And if she was wrong, if she'd missed something, misjudged something, led them into danger, that weight would be hers to carry forever. What does it cost to be right when lives depend on your answer? The operation was scheduled for 300 hours. Sarah spent the previous day triple-checking every detail of her analysis, looking for the flaw she might have missed, the assumption that could get someone killed. The intelligence briefing room was packed with personnel from multiple units: Army Rangers, Briggs SEAL Team, Air Force combat controllers, helicopter crews. She stood at the front with Colonel Harrison, maps and satellite images projected on screens behind her. "Based on updated surveillance and pattern analysis," she began, her voice steady despite the adrenaline humming through her veins, "we've identified this compound as the primary weapons cache for Taliban operations in this sector." She pointed to a location 12 kilometers from the original target. "The enemy has been using a rotation system, moving supplies between 3 locations based on our patrol schedule. This is their current active site." She walked them through everything: the terrain analysis, access routes, defensive positions, expected enemy strength, every detail that could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophe. And this time, when she looked at Briggs, his arms weren't crossed. He was leaning forward, focused, asking tactical questions that showed he was taking this seriously. After the briefing, as personnel filed out to begin their pre-mission preparations, Briggs approached her. "Lieutenant," he said, and his tone was different now, still formal but without the edge of skepticism. "This is solid work, really solid." It wasn't an apology, wasn't acknowledgement of how he'd treated her before, but it was something. A bridge being built slowly, grudgingly. "Thank you, Chief. Bring everyone home safe." He nodded, holding her gaze for a moment longer than necessary, and she saw it then. The weight he carried, the responsibility for his team, the fear hidden beneath the confidence. They weren't so different, she realized. Both trying to keep people alive in a place designed to kill them. That night, Sarah sat in the operations center listening to radio chatter as the mission unfolded in real time. She'd never felt more useless. All her analysis, all her work, and now all she could do was wait and listen and hope she'd been right. "Approaching primary target location," came the first report. Her heart hammered. Visual confirmation of structures matching intelligence description. Her breath steadied slightly. "Multiple vehicles present. Estimate 20 to 30 personnel." She closed her eyes, running through the numbers in her head, matching them against her predictions. Then contact. Gunfire crackled through the radio. Voices calling out positions, coordinates, status updates. The controlled chaos of combat translated into electronic bursts. Sarah sat frozen, listening to her analysis play out in real time, and all she could think was, "Please let me have been right. Please let them all come home." The firefight lasted 18 minutes. Each one felt like an hour. When the compound was secured and the all-clear signal came through, Sarah finally exhaled. "Multiple weapons confirmed," the report continued. "Large cache of ammunition, explosives, RPGs. This is significant, Kilo. This is exactly what intelligence predicted." Colonel Harrison, monitoring from beside her, placed a hand on her shoulder. "Outstanding work, Lieutenant." But Sarah barely heard him. She was counting the voices on the radio, counting the personnel reports, making sure everyone who went out was coming back. 0 casualties, 0 wounded, mission successful. Only then did she let herself feel anything, not triumph, not vindication, but overwhelming relief that her analysis hadn't gotten anyone killed. When the teams returned at dawn, there was celebration throughout the base. Backslaps and congratulations, the kind of energy that follows successful operations. Sarah stayed in the background, watching, feeling oddly disconnected from the joy around her. This was their victory, not hers. They'd risked everything. She just pointed them in the right direction. But then Briggs found her, walked straight across the operations center with his team behind him, and in front of everyone he extended his hand. "Lieutenant Martinez," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "I owe you more than an apology. I owe you my thanks. Your intelligence work made last night possible." She shook his hand, nodding the firm grip, the directness in his eyes. "I'm just glad everyone came home safely." "They did, and that's partly because your intelligence gave us exactly what we needed to plan an effective operation." He paused, and something shifted in his expression, Not quite vulnerability, but close. I've worked with a lot of intelligence officers over the years. Some were good, some were adequate, and some were dangerous because they didn't know the difference. You're the first one I'd trust completely with my team's lives. The words hit harder than she expected. Not because they were praise, she'd received plenty of that in her career, but because they were real. Because they came from someone who doubted her, tested her, and found her worthy. Because they meant something more than a medal or a commendation ever could. As the day progressed, Sarah felt the atmosphere around her change. Personnel who'd barely acknowledged her existence now sought her out, asked questions, requested her input, treated her like she belonged instead of like she was on trial. But the real shift came that evening in the dining facility. She entered with her meal tray, scanning for an empty seat, and saw Briggs wave her over to where he sat with his team. "Lieutenant, would you care to join us?" It was a simple invitation, but its significance was unmistakable. This was the operator's table, the informal fraternity of those who'd proven themselves in combat, and she was being welcomed not as a guest but as an equal. She took the offered seat, and for the first time since arriving at Fob Kilo, she felt like she could breathe without proving something. When does respect stop being something you earn and start being something you deserve? The weeks following Operation Desert Strike changed everything. Not dramatically, not obviously, but in the thousand small ways that matter more than grand gestures. Soldiers greeted her by name. Operators sought her input during mission planning. Briggs' team invited her to informal briefings where the real work got done, not just the official presentations. But Sarah noticed something else too. The younger female personnel on base, the few that were there, started appearing in the operations center more often, asking questions, watching how she worked, looking for something she recognized from her own early career, proof that it was possible, that competence could overcome skepticism, that a woman in uniform could be seen as a soldier first. One afternoon, a young Army specialist named Cooper approached her desk hesitantly. "Ma'am, I hope I'm not interrupting." Sarah looked up from her analysis. "Not at all, specialist. What can I help you with?" Cooper shifted uncomfortably. "I'm interested in intelligence work, thinking about trying for a transfer to an analyst position, but I've heard. I mean, some people say that women have to work twice as hard to get half the recognition." Sarah set down her pen, giving the young woman her full attention. "That's true," she said honestly, "but here's what they don't tell you: working twice as hard makes you twice as good, and eventually being twice as good becomes impossible to ignore." Is it worth it? The question was simple, but Sarah heard everything underneath it. The doubt, the fear, the wondering if the fight was worth the exhaustion. "That depends," Sarah said carefully. "Are you doing this to prove something to people who have already decided you can't? Or are you doing this because intelligence work is where you belong, where your skills are best used, where you can make the biggest difference?" Cooper thought about that. "The second one, I think, I hope." "Then yes," Sarah said firmly. "It's worth it, not because you'll change everyone's mind, you won't, but because you'll know you didn't let their doubts become your limits." After Cooper left, Sarah sat for a long time thinking about her own journey. How many times she'd questioned whether it was worth it. How many nights she'd wondered if it would be easier to just accept the limits others wanted to place on her. How close she'd come to giving up, not because she couldn't do the work, but because constantly proving herself was exhausting in ways that had nothing to do with the job itself. But then she thought about Cooper, about the young women who came after her, who would face their own versions of Chief Briggs, their own moments of having to prove what should have been assumed. And she realized that her success wasn't just about her anymore. It was about making the path easier for those who followed. That evening, Colonel Harrison called her into his office. "I wanted to give you this before it becomes official," he said, handing her a letter on command letterhead. She read it carefully. A formal commendation for her work on Operation Desert Strike, recommendation for accelerated promotion consideration, words like exceptional and instrumental and highest standards of professional competence. It was everything she should have wanted, everything that proved she'd succeeded. "Thank you, sir," she said. "This means a lot." Harrison leaned back in his chair. You've earned it, Lieutenant. More than that, you've changed the culture here, made us better at what we do. That matters more than any single operation. As Sarah walked back to her quarters that night, she thought about how she'd arrived at Fob Kilo expecting resistance and found it. Expected skepticism and earned respect. Expected to fight for every inch of credibility and discovered that sometimes the fight itself was what proved you worthy. But she'd also learned something she hadn't expected. That earning respect from people like Briggs wasn't about changing who she was. It was about being so undeniably competent that they had to change how they saw her. The confrontation that had seemed so challenging when she first arrived now felt like a necessary part of the process. Briggs' initial skepticism had pushed her to higher standards, made her sharper, forced her to be better. And his eventual acknowledgement carried weight precisely because it had been earned, not granted automatically. She'd learned that respect in combat zones wasn't about rank or credentials. It was about results, about keeping people alive, about being right when being wrong could cost lives. And she'd proven, over and over, that she could deliver when it mattered most. A month after the operation, Briggs sought her out in the operations center. "Got a minute, Lieutenant?" She looked up from her work. "Of course, Chief. What's on your mind?" He sat down across from her, uncharacteristically hesitant. I need to tell you something. That first day when we met, I was an ass. No, don't wave it off. I was. I judged you before you'd even opened your mouth, decided you couldn't do the job based on nothing but my own assumptions." Sarah waited, letting him work through whatever he needed to say. "I told myself I was being professional, that I was just skeptical of desk analysts in general, but that was bullshit. I was skeptical of you specifically because you were a woman, and I'm man enough now to admit that was wrong." He met her eyes directly. "I'm sorry. You deserved better from me from the start." The apology was unexpected, unnecessary even. They'd moved past it weeks ago, built a working relationship based on mutual respect. But Sarah appreciated it anyway, not because she needed his regret but because it showed growth. "I appreciate you saying that, Chief, truly, but you know what? I'm not sure I'd want it any different." He looked surprised. "Really?" "Really? Because if you just accepted me from day one, if everyone had, I wouldn't have pushed myself as hard, wouldn't have triple-checked every analysis, wouldn't have built the foundation that makes my work reliable now." She paused. "Your skepticism made me better, and your respect now means something because I earned it." Briggs nodded slowly. "That's a hell of a way to look at it, but I still wish I'd made it easier for you." "Making it easy isn't your job," Sarah said simply. "Your job is to keep your team alive. My job is to give you the intelligence to do that. We both did our jobs, that's what matters." What neither of them said, but both understood, was that this conversation was about more than their individual relationship. It was about what came next, about the Coopers and other young women who would face their own moments of doubt, about creating an environment where competence was recognized regardless of who delivered it. Why is it that the quiet moments matter more than the loud ones? Sarah's deployment at Fob Kilo eventually came to an end, as all deployments do. The day before her rotation out, she took one last walk around the base, memorizing details she knew would fade but wanted to hold on to. The way the mountains looked at sunset, the sound of helicopters coming and going, the smell of dust and diesel that permeated everything. She found herself at the operations center one final time, looking at the maps that had become as familiar as her own reflection. All those valleys, all those missions, all those moments where her analysis had meant the difference between success and failure, between safety and danger. Colonel Harrison found her there. "Thinking about staying?" he asked with a slight smile. "Thinking about what comes next," Sarah said. "This place. It changed things for me, changed how I see the work." "It changed things for us too," Harrison replied. "The intelligence operations here are running smoother than they have in years, and that's your legacy. Not just the successful missions, but the standard you set, the example you left." He paused. "We're putting together recommendations for your next assignment. Where do you see yourself going?" Sarah thought about that. about all the fob kilos out there, all the places where the same dynamics played out, where female soldiers still had to prove themselves twice over, where competence was still questioned before it was accepted. Wherever I can make a difference, she said finally. Wherever the work matters. That evening, Briggs and his team threw an informal send-off in the dining facility. No official ceremony, no formal speeches, just pizza from the care packages, warm soda, and the kind of casual conversation that meant more than any medal ceremony. "So where are they sending you next, Lieutenant?" one of the SEALs asked. "Not sure yet. Somewhere that needs someone who can spot patterns in chaos, probably." Briggs raised his soda can in a mock toast. "Their gain, our loss." "Seriously though, Martinez, you set the bar high. Whoever comes after you has big boots to fill." "They'll fill them," Sarah said confidently. "Maybe differently than I did, but they'll fill them. That's the thing about this work, there's always someone ready to step up." As the evening wound down and personnel drifted away to their duties, Sarah found herself alone with Briggs one last time. "I learned something from you," he said quietly. "Something I should have known already but needed to see proven. Want to know what it was?" "Tell me." "That the best intelligence officers aren't the ones who try to impress you with their credentials or their theories. The best ones are the people who understand that their job is to help keep other people alive and bring them home safely. Everything else is just background noise." Sarah felt something tighten in her chest, because that was it, wasn't it? That was the whole job distilled down to its purest form. Not about being right, not about proving doubters wrong, about keeping people alive. "That's always been my understanding of the job," she said, "and that's what makes all the difference." Later that night, completing her final reports, Sarah reflected on everything she'd learned at FOB Kilo, the technical skills she'd refined, the analytical methods she'd perfected, the operational understanding she'd deepened. But more than that, she'd learned about leadership, about patience, about the responsibility that came with intelligence work in environments where mistakes cost lives. She'd arrived expecting to fight for respect and found something more valuable. Proof that respect earned through competence was worth more than respect granted through assumption. She'd faced skepticism and discovered it could be a gift if you used it right. She'd encountered resistance and learned it could sharpen you into something stronger. A note was waiting on her desk, written on official letterhead. "Lieutenant Martinez, your exceptional intelligence work exemplifies the highest standards of professional competence and dedication. Your analysis was instrumental in the success of multiple critical operations. Well done. Colonel James Harrison, Commanding Officer, FOB Kilo." The formal recognition was gratifying, but Sarah knew the real measure of her success was something else entirely. It was in the missions that succeeded, the operators who came home, the young specialist who now believed intelligence work was possible for her, the culture that had shifted, slowly, stubbornly, toward accepting competence wherever it came from. As she prepared to leave the operations center for the final time, Sarah understood that her experience at FOB Kilo had changed her as much as it had changed others' perceptions of her. She'd learned that confrontation wasn't always conflict. Sometimes it was the necessary friction that polished both sides into something better. She'd learned that respect was a two-way street requiring mutual understanding and appreciation of different expertise. She'd learned that the responsibility of intelligence work was heavier than she'd ever imagined, and more rewarding than she'd dared to hope. The challenge that had seemed so daunting when she first arrived, proving herself to people who'd already decided she couldn't do the job, now appeared as exactly what she'd needed. Not because it was fair, not because it was right, but because it had pushed her to standards she might not have reached otherwise. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, a new base, new personnel who hadn't learned what Briggs and his team had learned, new opportunities to prove again that competence transcended assumptions. But tonight, walking back to her quarters under an Afghan sky full of stars, Sarah felt a deep satisfaction about what she'd accomplished. She'd arrived as an unknown intelligence officer facing doubt and subtle challenges. She was leaving as someone who had proven her worth through results that mattered to everyone involved, not through demands or arguments, but through the quiet insistence of being undeniably good at her job. The skeptics would always exist, the Briggses of the world who needed to see proof before they could believe. And that was okay, because she'd learned the secret they didn't teach in training. Sometimes, dignity doesn't need to argue its case. Sometimes, competence doesn't need to explain itself. Sometimes, the most powerful response to doubt is simply doing the work so well that questions become irrelevant. As Sarah reached her quarters, she felt the weight of the deployment lifting and the anticipation of what came next settling in its place. Tomorrow would bring new tests, new people who needed convincing, new opportunities to prove that excellence had no gender, only standards. But tonight she could rest knowing she had met every challenge, exceeded every expectation, and earned the respect of her peers through something that could never be taken away: unwavering competence, absolute dedication, and the unshakable commitment to keeping people alive. That was the mission. Everything else was just noise. And in the quiet of her final night at Fob Kilo, Sarah Martinez understood what she'd always known but had needed to prove one more time: that the best answer to skepticism wasn't anger or argument or explanation. It was simply this: do the work. Do it better than anyone expected. Do it so well that doubt becomes impossible. And then, when respect finally comes, and it will come, accept it with the same quiet dignity you showed when it was withheld. Because sometimes the greatest victory isn't in proving others wrong. It's in remaining so true to your purpose that their opinions become irrelevant. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts, and the action in the end is all the proof that matters.